Sheila, you're still with us? Can you hear me?
Just froze, yeah.
Oh,
Yes, I can. So
okay, thank you.
right now.
Okay, can I ask you a question? What scope do we, or does SCOGO have as a committee to propose amendments to bill, the carbon tax legislation?
Is everybody on the phone lines ready to go? I'll take that as a yes, and we'll get started in about 10 seconds here. Vince, can you make us live? Good afternoon, everyone. I will call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations back to order. My name is Rylund Johnson. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife North and chair for this committee. Today we will be reviewing Bill 60, an act to amend the Petroleum Products and Carbon Acts with the minister and their staff. I'll begin by asking MLAs to introduce themselves, beginning on my left.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Caitlin Cleveland, Cam Lake.
Thank you. And to those online, beginning with our deputy chair, MLA Martselos.
Emily Marcellus, member for Chewbacca.
Lisa Semler, MLA for Nuvik Twin Lakes.
Ron Bonitus, MLA Decho.
Thank you, members. We are also joined by our law clerk, Sheila McPherson, our committee advisor, Nigel Lork, and committee clerk, Cynthia James. As standing committee, it is our role to review any legislation introduced in the House. The committee review stage provides opportunity for stakeholders and public to provide input. Our first public hearing today is going to be with the minister and staff to get some factual information, but we will accept written submissions from any members of the public or any stakeholders who wish to make submissions on the bill or have any thoughts on the carbon tax. Please reach out to committee. Committee will consider all concerns brought forward. Just a reminder on procedure for members and staff. I remind everyone that to direct all questions through myself as chair to help keep the meeting organized and running smoothly. Please wait to be recognized by myself as chair before speaking. And with that, I will invite Minister Wawzonek, sponsor of the bill, to proceed with any opening remarks in her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am here today to discuss Bill 60, an act to amend the Petroleum Products and Carbon Tax Act, and to update Standing Committee on the Department of Finance's proposals to meet the revised federal carbon pricing benchmarks for 2023 to 2030. And that is part of the GNWT's commitment to the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. With me today on my right is Bill McKay, Deputy Minister of Finance, Terence Coutre, Deputy Secretary to the Financial Management Board, Kelly Bluck, Director of Fiscal Policy, and Drew Robertson is my Ministerial Special Advisor. As committee knows, the federal government made a commitment to see carbon pricing implemented across Canada during 2018 and has updated the federal criteria for the 2023 to 2030 period. The GNWT chose to increase its carbon tax rates and revise the Northwest Territories' approach to recycling the revenues generated by the carbon tax to remain in compliance with the federal government's own carbon pricing commitments. As a result, Bill 60 was introduced to amend the Petroleum Products and Carbon Tax Act to include a new schedule of carbon tax rates from April 1st, 2023 to April 1st, 2030. In addition to annual increases in carbon tax rates starting April 1st, 2023, to meet the revised federal carbon pricing benchmarks, the GNWT must eliminate all carbon tax rebates that negate the carbon price signal, with the exception of the tax rebate for fuel used to generate electricity for community distribution. With the permission of the chair, I would like to provide a presentation describing the GNWT's revised proposed approach to carbon pricing that will encourage carbon conservation and substitution to reduce GHG emissions, while as much as possible not adding to the high cost of living or creating additional barriers to economic development. After which, my staff and I will be available to answer any questions committee may have about the carbon tax rate increases or the revenue recycling approach. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Go ahead with your presentation.
I presume we are going to have it loaded up. I think it's coming.
There we go.
Great, thanks. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. So I will go through the presentation, after which we'll take questions from the committee. So I'll just go to the first slide. So that this is just going to outline changes to the federal carbon pricing. So just as background for the committee, as we noted in the opening remarks and in our last presentation, the federal government passed the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act in 2018, and this was in response to the commitments made in the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And that act has been in place for a number of years now, but there was always anticipated that there would be changes to the federal carbon pricing benchmarks, and they were scheduled to come in 2023. So in that time, we did learn of the changes to the national carbon pricing benchmarks for 2023 to 2030. And the main changes to those will be that carbon price will increase annually by $15 a ton of greenhouse gas equivalent emissions, starting at $65 a ton on April 1st, 2023, and then rising to $170 per ton by 2020. Jurisdictions may keep their own systems, as the NWT has their own system in place, but they must use the same carbon price and coverage as the federal system, and they must ensure rebates and any use of carbon tax revenues do not negate the carbon price signal. So this is an important change to the benchmarks, which we'll go through what the ramifications of that are in this presentation. So next slide, please. So as I noted, there is different carbon pricing schemes across the country, but all were within the federal benchmarks. So there are a number of jurisdictions that just use the federal system. So they're outlined in blue in this map here, and then others have a hybrid or their own system. And you may have seen on the news that Saskatchewan now is fully in their own system now, so they've adopted an alternative, or a Saskatchewan alternative to the federal output-based price system. So that's how the map looks, and you'll see the 3 territories. Northwest Territories has their own system, and the other 2 territories have adopted the federal system. Next slide, please. So, as the committee knows, the point of the carbon tax is to induce the reduction of the use of carbon-based fuel by encouraging both conservation by building renovations, lowering thermostats, driving less, just taking measures to reduce your use of the fuel, and then also substitution to other sources of energy that don't use carbon-based fuel. So, such as wind, solar, hydroelectricity, electric vehicles, and untaxed biomass such as wood pellets. But we would notice, as I'm sure all of you would also observe, the overall emission reductions will be limited in the NWT because we don't have many substitutions or alternatives that we can turn to. So the incentive will really be based on on encouraging residents to conserve more carbon-based fuel. Next slide, please. So we're recommending that the GNWT choose to retain its own carbon tax regime, and so we have been working with ECCC, the Environment and Climate Change Canada, to ensure that what we're proposing is within the benchmarks that the federal government has set out. So, as I mentioned before, in order to stay within those benchmarks, the GNWT must first amend the Petroleum Products Carbon Tax Act to add the new carbon tax rates. So that's the Bill 60 that's before the committee right now. That's just to change the carbon tax rates. And then we're also proposing to amend the regulations and policy to eliminate the rebates on heating fuel and the large emitters, and then also to eliminate or revise the large emitter grant program. So on September 1st, 2022, the GNWT provided ECCC with the proposed carbon revenue recycling programs, which we'll get into later in this presentation, and they confirmed that those proposed recycling programs don't negate the carbon pricing signal, so that they don't, in other words, they don't remove the incentive to conserve or substitute to an alternative fuel source. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have 4 proposed changes that I'll go through with in this presentation for committee that are intended to change our current carbon tax regime so that it will meet the new federal benchmarks. So the first is to increase the carbon tax rates annually by $15 a ton of greenhouse gas emissions starting April 1st, 2023. So that'll just track the federal carbon tax increases. The second thing is to replace the at-source carbon tax rebate on heating fuel with the increased cost of living offset payments. And then the third thing is to eliminate the large emitter grant program. And then fourthly, to replace the 72% large emitter rebate, which was previously measured against emissions, with a rebate measured against a baseline average of 3 consecutive years of fuel consumption. So the baseline will be based on fuel consumption rather than emissions. Okay, next slide, please. So first, I'll go through all 4 of those in some detail. So the first is increasing the carbon tax rates. So if you go to the next slide, please. So this just outlines for committee what the increases will be on specific types of fuel. So it goes through the types of fuel. Aviation fuel, I don't think I've mentioned earlier, but that remains exempt from the carbon tax. And then the rest are listed here: butane, diesel, gasoline, naphtha, natural gas, and propane. And this gives committee the specific tax on each of those types of fuel going to 2030, and that's basically how the $15 and as it increased, the $15 carbon tax gets translated into specific fuel type prices. Next slide, please. So before I get into the second aspect of the carbon tax, or the carbon tax changes we're proposing, I just want to highlight some of the impacts on the cost of living that the carbon tax will have in the Northwest Territories. So first, higher carbon taxes will raise the cost of living and the cost of doing business in the NWT. So people will have higher costs for home heating costs, for one thing, is the obvious one, but also businesses themselves will have higher costs, and that may affect what they charge their consumers. Higher living and operating costs will stress the finances of households and small businesses, especially in this current environment of high inflation. So we implemented COLO payments when we initially put in place the NWT carbon tax legislation, and we intend to keep those in and to increase them so they'll alleviate the rise in living costs, because and hopefully will fully offset both the direct and indirect costs of the carbon tax on households. So just at $65 a ton, the carbon tax is estimated to cost the average NWT household an extra $675 a year, or 0.5% of average family income. Next slide, please. And then just looking from the household point of view to the broader economic point of view for the NWT economy, higher carbon tax rates mean that residents will have less disposable income and businesses will have higher costs to provide goods and services. And although we don't have the numbers for the NWT specifically, in 2018, Canada estimated that carbon pricing would cause a 0.32% decline in GDP at $50 a ton, and then by the time it got to the $170 a ton, that would be translated into a 1.1% decline in GDP by 2030. But just to put those in perspective, if we were to translate those national declines in GDP to the NWT economy, yes, they would be. It would be difficult for the economy and a setback, but if we were to look at it in the grander scheme of things, there are other challenges to the economy that we just thought we'd identify in this slide, such as the diamond mine closures, labor shortages, and the undiversified economy, which pose arguably a greater threat to the economy than the carbon tax. Next slide, please. So the second element I just want to go through with the committee is replacing the carbon tax rebate for heating fuel. So I'll just go into that in a little more detail. So the current NWT system is an at-source carbon tax rebate for heating fuel because it recognizes economically viable non-carbon heating fuel alternatives are currently unavailable to many residents. High fuel prices already provide residents with incentive to reduce fuel use. So in other words, the price of fuel in the NWT is so much higher than, and so much a bigger portion of families' incomes that there's already, we believe, an incentive to reduce fuel use. So that's why we argued against having heating fuel included in the first round of the carbon tax. And then a large proportion of people in public housing do not incur heating costs. And mitigating the carbon tax cost for businesses and municipal governments is also important for the reasons I suggested before, because a lot of those extra costs get passed on to consumers and to residents from businesses and municipalities. Next slide, please. So our proposed change is to have carbon revenue recycling program that will be issued through the current system, which is the COLO, and we'll replace the existing heating fuel rebate, which is in place now, with an increase in the COLO payments starting 2023. So residents will receive an increase to their COLO payments equal to the average annual heating costs, increase due to the carbon tax. So the carbon tax rate of $65 a ton is expected to cost NWT households an extra $400 for heating per year. So COLO amounts per resident will go up by $135, and that's per person. So per household, assuming the average household is around 3 people per household, it gets close to that $400 household cost of heating. And businesses and municipal governments and other organizations won't receive the COLO, so they'll pay the full carbon tax. And we're assuming, as I mentioned before, that much of that extra cost will be passed on to consumers, so we're hoping the COLO will offset some of those costs as well. Next slide, please. And then our plan is to have the COLO increase in step with the carbon tax. So this chart here just shows how the COLO payments will increase from now until 2030, which is the planned increase in the carbon tax, $270. So that's this just outlines how those COLO payments will increase over that period of time. Next slide, please. Okay, so a family of 2 adults and 2 children receive quarterly payments of $499 from July 2023 to June 2024, so that would come out to $1,996 total. The COLO payments will be made quarterly starting July 1st of each year, and as I mentioned before, they increase as tax rates increase. It adds in an amount for heating fuel to the already established adult and dependent COLO amounts. So we have those amounts, as I mentioned, we've increase those to reflect the loss of the heating fuel rebate. And those COLO payments will continue to offset the direct and indirect costs of the carbon tax of an average household. So the average household will spend an estimated $675 due to direct and indirect costs of the carbon tax at the current, or the April 1st amount of $65 a ton of emissions. Next slide, please. So here we're just trying to outline for committee what we see as the advantages and drawbacks of the COLO increase. So first, it complies with the original COLO objectives, which is to return carbon tax to residents without negating the price signal. So they're still when people go to the pump, they'll see an increased price, and then that increased price presumably will encourage them to reduce consumption, but they will also get this COLO as well. So there's still an incentive to reduce consumption, even though some of the costs are offset. It won't create additional administrative costs because the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency, administers the COLO as they do now. They'll continue to. And the increases to COLO payments can be done through regulations. So each year they can automatically be increased through a regulation, and it can be done quite efficiently that way. Drawbacks include that it doesn't distinguish between residents who are incurring the carbon tax for heat and those who do not. So this goes to everybody basically that files an income tax return. It doesn't take into account if you're a homeowner or you're a renter or you're actually paying more of the carbon tax because of the increase. It doesn't distinguish between households with high heating costs due to family size, region, house type, and or heating fuel source, or households with low or no heating costs. And finally, another drawback is it doesn't address the additional heating costs for businesses, local governments, and other organizations. So as I mentioned before, those additional costs are going to be passed on to the consumers or to residents. Next slide, please. So just to kind of extrapolate on the second point I made in the last slide, the current COLO doesn't distinguish between regions, and this just outlines what the effect of the carbon tax will be on home heating bills, because it does range quite a bit between communities. So this outlines for committee what the carbon tax increase will be for different communities, and then the middle line shows where communities fall either below or above the line. Majority of communities do fall below the line, and majority of residents, but there is an issue with some communities which are significantly above that line. And I think the committee's raised this issue before, and MLAs have raised this issue, and the minister is looking at ways we can address this issue. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the impact on households, just to outline that, in the NWT, there's 7,990 households are owned homes. So those will be the ones that are most impacted by the carbon tax because they pay their own heating fuel. 4,000 are market rentals. Difficult to tell how they'll be impacted. Some landlords pay that cost for their renters, but although presumably that would get passed on in the rent. But some other landlords have the tenants pay the heating costs. So it's hard to tell what the impact will be on that. I think it'll be mixed. And then finally, 4,000 households are on social or affordable housing, receive the COLO, but don't pay a carbon tax on heat and have no incentive to reduce emissions because they arguably don't have an incentive to reduce emissions, at least for heating costs, because they're not paying that directly. Next slide, please. The other impact we just thought we'd highlight for the committee, which we thought was interesting, is that family structure and housing, as you're probably aware, housing needs are changing in the NWT, and these changes could impact over the next period of time during this when this carbon tax changes take effect, just 2023 to 2030. Some of the trends which might impact that are that the population in the NWT is relatively stable, but household and family sizes are shrinking. So the average family size in 2021 is 3 people, average number of children per family 1.8. Single parent families account for nearly 1/4 of households with children, and one-person households comprise over 1/4 of households, meaning close to 4,000 NWT residents lived alone, and that number as well is growing. So smaller families and household size will require more housing, and increased housing stock is going to lead to increased overall energy consumption. So this is not something we're dealing with right now, but a trend we're watching for 2030 in case as something we may need to address in the future. Right, next slide, please. So just as a kind of summary of the impact on households, I think it's clear from all this that households living in owned homes and some market rentals will be disproportionately affected by the removal of the at-source carbon tax rebate on heating fuel, and increasing COLO payments may not fully offset that, the removal of that rebate because of the way the COLO payment is paid. So we are looking, as I mentioned, at other options. So first, a heating fuel rebate potentially exclusively for homeowners, and that, we're considering this as the committee considers these proposals and talks to the public. And then the other one, which I think we've mentioned before, is that COLO payments could be increased based on average regional heating fuel use, so that certain regions that, because of factors that are out of the household's control have higher heating costs, they could be maybe get a different COLO payment than others. Next slide, please. So impact on business, as we mentioned, that is going to be a direct impact on business costs and municipalities, so they won't have the heating fuel rebate, and likely a lot of these costs will be passed on to consumers, but it depends on a number of factors which we outline in this slide, including the business size, the community, industry competition, market demand, and government support. But we do believe that obviously a lot of these higher heating costs are going to be passed on to residents. We would note, though, that there is some supports for business in terms of trying to reduce their consumption, and those are available through the Energy Strategy and Arctic Energy Alliance that give them strategies to reduce fuel consumption, and that might reduce the carbon tax that they have to pay in their overall costs. Next slide, please. So the third feature of the carbon tax proposal that we have in front of committee is that we will eliminate the large emitter grants. The next slide. So under the current system, the grant program is tied to facilities emissions and doesn't meet Canada's new carbon pricing benchmarks. And to comply with the federal benchmarks, the large emitter grant program would need to be based on a non-emissions metric. So it has to be based on output, assets, or floor space, not specifically tied to emissions. And we have to guarantee the grant would not be paid out largely based on emissions, which the current one is. And it also needs to add an administrative burden with minimal value in meeting emissions targets. So it can't have a large administrative burden. So Canada is concerned that one of the main concerns Canada had in our discussions with them about our current system, current large emitter grant, is that businesses could use the large emitter grant to make capital improvements that they would have made anyway to improve their productivity, but this would allow the government to essentially pay for them because we give the grant back to them to pay for capital improvements that they probably would have made anyway. And again, as I mentioned before, it can't be tied to actual fuel consumption, so we've made it based on fuel. It can't be tied to emissions, so we've made it based on fuel consumption, which the federal government just said is okay. Next slide. I think we went backwards there. Sure. Okay, next one. Yeah, okay, thanks. No problem. So, proposed change, we're going to discontinue the large emitter grant after March 31st, 2023. The revenue already accrued in each mine's fund will remain available for 5 years, so they'll be able to use that over the next 5 years. Next slide. So just again to outline for a committee at least our perception of what the advantages and drawbacks are of this feature of the plan, which is to eliminate the large emitter grant. The first advantage is it satisfies Environment Canada's criteria of not negating the carbon price signal, and it also allows existing large emitters to retain access to the funds for another 5 years. So there is potential for them to use these funds to reduce their emissions, and so they have 5 years to do that. Drawback is the elimination of a program that returned tax revenue as an incentive to reduce GHG emissions. So we think that's a drawback of getting rid of the large emitter fund, but that had to be done in order to comply with the federal benchmarks. So next slide, please. So next feature, just to outline, is replacing the large emitter rebates. So the current large emitter rebate is tied to a facility's actual emissions and does not meet Canada's new carbon pricing benchmarks. So this current system was designed to maintain comparability with the existing federal output-based pricing system while ensuring that large emitters have a similar carbon tax burden to the average NWT household. So because they were large emitters, obviously they would be paying a lot of carbon tax, so the point of having this large emitter rebate was to give them a little bit, allow them to maintain competition with other large emitters in the country and internationally. Next slide, please. So the proposed change is to rebate 72% of the carbon tax to a predetermined facility-specific fixed baseline for each mine. So it wouldn't be based on emissions. And this will help mitigate the risk that a mine could receive more in rebates than paid in carbon tax. So there was that risk that because of the way it was calculated in terms of emissions, it went back in time. So there was a risk that you could be rebated more than you're actually paying carbon tax in a given year. So this will be reviewed when the mine's closing to ensure the mine does not receive a higher rebate than the carbon tax paid. So that's essentially when that might happen, is when the number of emissions are lowering. So next slide. So advantages and drawbacks. First, advantages. So this helps mitigate the penalty for being under the NWT carbon tax instead of the federal OBPS. Keeps the system simple by using fuel volume data. So we already collect that in our tax system. So it's easy for us to calculate how much fuel large emitters are using. Allows same treatment regardless of mine size. So under the federal system, they have an opt-in provision for emitters with greater than 10 kilotons of emissions, but new NWT mines may emit less than that. So that this gives us a better capture of the mines within the NWT and given their size. It allows flexibility for special treatment during mine construction and closure, and this again is not covered under the federal system. And ensures that, as I mentioned before, that large emitters share a similar tax burden to Northwest Territories residents. So it's not overburdensome on them as compared to other residents, or more importantly, other businesses. Drawbacks are the risk that large emitters can reduce consumption far below the baseline, that the rebate is greater than the carbon tax paid. So that's one drawback, but we mitigate that by only rebating a percentage of the carbon tax below that baseline. And we'll go into more detail on how that works later in the presentation. The next slide, please. So just to give you a better sense of how we set those baselines, it's going to be based on the average fuel consumption for 3 years of operation. So divided up into 3 different phases of mine operation. Existing mines would have average fuel consumption measured from 2018-19 to 2021-22. Adjust if there are production disruptions and shutdowns of the mine between those years. New mines will receive a 72% rebate of carbon tax paid for 36 months of operation until a baseline is established. And then the mine construction phase, a special intensity baseline for mine construction is under review. So we still haven't decided where we're going to land there, but we're looking at what to do with mine construction. Next slide, please. And this outlines how the tax rate will be arrived at in terms of under the modified large emitter rebate. So we can probably, it might be better to go through in detail with this during the questions, but we have this chart here for committee, and this outlines how the tax rate is calculated, the rebate rate is applied, fuel consumption is measured, so establishes the baseline, and then that establishes the fixed baseline. Then the company will pay the carbon tax, their rebate is applied, rebate with the fixed baseline, and then you get to your net carbon tax. So in the first example here, it turns out to be $4.2 million, and the effective tax rate becomes 41%. But like I said, we can go through, I know this is pretty complicated, so we can go through it in more detail during after we're finished the presentation. Next slide, please. Carbon tax revenues and expenditures. So rebates will decline over time as existing mines cease operations. And at the same time, the total carbon tax offset program budget will also decline. So net carbon tax revenue remaining will go into general revenues, but then can be applied notionally to specific greenhouse gas reducing investments to mitigate the effects of the carbon tax on business and community governments. So we can use the tax, the net tax. So we do have quite a bit of the revenue going back to residents through the COLO and other programs, but we will have a net revenue coming from the tax, and we can use that revenue to also help mitigate the effects of the carbon tax on businesses and community governments. Next slide, please. So this outlines exactly what the net benefit or the net fiscal benefit to the government will be with the carbon tax revenues and expenditures. So you can see the benefit doesn't necessarily go up as the carbon tax goes up, because the amount of money going out in form of COLO and other programs will also go up as the carbon tax goes up. So the net carbon tax revenue, which is the bottom line there, that just shows you what the GNWT will be collecting from the carbon tax. So that number there, as I mentioned, doesn't necessarily move directly upwards as the carbon tax goes up. So that just reflects that more and more of the money that we're collecting will be going back into programs to offset the costs to residents. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, the next steps, we first have the approval process for changing the carbon tax pricing rates and covers. So the bill here is just meant to amend the carbon tax rates, and that was introduced in October. And it will come before the Legislative Assembly for consideration in the February session. And if it's passed by the Legislative Assembly, it'll come into force April 1st, 2023, which is when the new federal carbon tax comes in force. And then the approval process for changing the carbon tax expenditures. So we'll continue to refine the carbon tax expenditure proposals. So that's what we have before you, but we're continuing to change them as we get public input on that and input from the committee. But we will have to engage with Environment and Climate Change Canada to ensure that any revisions that we make will meet federal benchmarks. And we'll change the regulations for carbon expenditures after the 23-24 budget approval. So in March of 2023 is when we expect all those regulatory changes to be approved. Okay, so that is the last slide. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Minister and Deputy Minister, for your presentation. I'll now open it up to committee for any questions, beginning with MLA Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister and staff for the presentation today. A hard one to have to deliver. I know not met with excitement for sure from this side of the House, but we appreciate your time. It's a hard conversation, but an important one, and the message that I'm definitely hearing from the people that I serve, individuals and businesses included, is that they just can't afford more expenses right now, and they feel like they're being hit from multiple angles with increases to costs of living and doing business in the Northwest Territories. And I think it's hard for people as well to swallow this one when we start talking about the number of greenhouse gas emissions that the Northwest Territories is actually responsible for in the long run. And I think that largely as a federal program to the territories ends up feeling like being very out of touch with the reality of life in the North on the part of the federal government. And so I think I have a number of questions, but to start off, I think I'd like to know more information about how the conversation went with the federal government, as far as I know that during session there was a strong ask from this side of the House to go back to the federal government to see what other options there are for the Northwest Territories. And so I'm curious to know how the government responded to the federal government rather responded to the potential that Bill 60 might not pass in the Northwest Territories, and what that means for the Northwest Territories and the GNWT as well. So I'm wondering if, to start off, if we can find out more information about what a federal backstop would mean in the Northwest Territories if Bill 60 does not pass. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Cleveland. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So two things is both the response of the feds, but then also what that would mean if there's so. I mean, with response to the federal government, I sent a fairly lengthy letter to them and have not had a response yet, but it hasn't been that long since they received it, and I think the turnaround time there is a little different than ours, for as much as there may be some complaints at times. So as to, and in addition to that, I know Minister Thompson will be at COP in Canada, in Montreal, next month, and is hoping to have some time with the federal minister, and will no doubt be raising this issue. And I'll be in Ottawa and Toronto myself earlier in December, and will hopefully have an opportunity to raise it at this time as well. So there's a few opportunities to come, other than to say that I don't have a response yet as to whether there'll be any changes or any exemptions or exceptions made for us. If the bill doesn't pass, then the federal system will apply. And exactly what that might look like in terms of what it does to the revenues to come back in, I don't know yet, because that would again be a subject of discussion with them. But happy to discuss that further at this point if there's more questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Emily Cleveland?
Thank you much. Mr. Chair, I really look forward to getting more information about what that other side looks like. I think being able to make decisions based on this bill is really contingent on knowing what the other side and the flip side looks like if Bill 60 doesn't pass. And so I think that's really important information for committee to know before being able to move forward. But My next question is in regards to impact to the GNWT. And so we've talked a lot about impact to large emitters. We've talked a lot about impact to residents. But there's also going to be a significant impact to the GNWT's bottom line. I mean, when we talk about seniors' home heating subsidies, when we talk about public housing, when we talk about public infrastructure, all of this is going to have a significant impact to the bottom line of the GNWT as well. And so I'm wondering if the GNWT has an idea of what that overall number looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Cleveland. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm not sure if we've pulled out, I mean, certainly there will be, there's no doubt, increased costs to the GNWT, but I don't know if I have that number in front of me. But let me try the Deputy Minister and see where we get to.
Deputy Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, the MLA is right. That will be a significant cost, but we haven't figured out exactly what that would be. But I can undertake to bring that information to committee. Thank you.
Thank you for that commitment, Deputy Minister. Next on the list, I have Emily O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm going to do my best to not repeat a number of comments I made at second reading on the bill, but I do have to express a lot of frustration with the lack of information that's been provided to regular MLAs. We've been asking for the analysis that the department may have done since July around particularly what the federal backstop looks like, and I can say that we have not received that information. Or the information that has been provided is often delayed and it's been kept confidential. And that's where we're at now, I guess, with this presentation today. But so I'm very frustrated with this, and I wanted the minister to know very clearly that if this bill continues to be put forward in the way that it is, with all the details left to regulations and the proposals that you've got in your presentation, I'm going to be voting against this bill. So I want the minister to know that very clearly. And I'm going to outline some of these reasons, but I want to start with what sort of consultation, if any, was undertaken with anybody in terms of preparing this bill. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'll turn that over to the department. They would have been responsible for doing any detailed consultation. But again, you know, just from the starting point, though, Mr. Chair, is that this is not, I know that this doesn't answer the long list of things that may have been requested, certainly back when the bill was originally, the original act was put forward in the last assembly. So this isn't a wholesale overview of this. This isn't a complete amendment of it. It really is, was intended to be fairly narrow in order to comply with the changes from the federal government. It was not an overhaul of the entire act, so it did not go through the commensurate levels of engagement or consultation that kind of a response would. But if I'll turn to the Deputy Minister with respect to the work that was undertaken for this particular changes that are here. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As the minister noted, this was just making some changes to an existing carbon tax regime. So there were some changes made. Our consultations were focused mainly on those most affected. So there was significant consultation with mines because we were considering doing away with the large emitter grant program, which would have meant that they would have lost access to that funding. So that was one of our main points of consultation. And then the other area that we're consulting is this process right now and engaging with the public in terms of what the best way of addressing these issues are. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. Follow-up, Emily O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks for that. Oh, I'm glad that we're now on record as that the department did undertake extensive consultations with the large mines, but nobody else. And I just think that that's patently unfair and not the way that we should be approaching this kind of legislation, but that's my personal view of it. So let's turn to, I think I think it's 34, where you can see the remaining carbon tax revenues, the last line on the slide. and it's generally, 23, 24 to 30, 31. It's in the neighborhood of about, it goes up and down between about 15 and 20 million dollars. What guarantee, if any, is there that that money will actually be spent on climate change initiatives, reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Because the way that the bill has been put together, there's this money just goes into the Consolidated Revenue Fund. There's no obligation to report. It's not tracked in any way as a separate fund or a revolving fund. So what kind of accountability and transparency is there going to be around the retained carbon tax revenue? Thanks, Mr. Chair. And, what does this bill do to actually support that in any way? Because there's nothing in the bill. There's nothing about public reporting. It's not a separate fund. It's not a revolving fund. So can the minister provide any sort of assurance that there's going to be any accountability around these retained carbon tax funds? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, not necessarily differently from any other funds that are received in terms of revenue, there is not usually a desire to create separate funds for every single initiative or every single topical area. There's a number of reasons that is so. For one, if you start to earmark revenues for something, then you're earmarking them, you're putting a handful in, but you might actually be spending an awful lot more. For instance, I was going to quickly try to pull up, percentages of different departments get for different things. I'm not going to be able to do that in the space of time I have here. But we don't want to necessarily say, well, GHG and climate change initiatives only get $15 million. That may actually not be sufficient, and that may not be an accurate accounting of what is required to achieve 2030 energy strategy, healthy lands, healthy people, all the different things we're doing. So earmarking funds can actually not necessarily be the best solution because it creates a barrier to increasing them more fluidly. Similarly, Mr. Chair, there can be instability. I mean, these are projections. As we've certainly seen in the last 2 years of COVID and floods, projections do not always, materialize into actuals. So certainly it would not necessarily mean that that's the best way to plan. In addition to which, the federal government may be bringing in more dollars, and we don't want to be, again, hamstringing ourselves and saying, well, we will only spend money that comes in through this source. Similarly, Mr. Chair, there's also the concern, well, what if, in fact, that you're not actually, deciding in terms of where money gets spent and how it gets spent really is the purview of the Legislative Assembly. And so in terms of understanding how much is being spent and the accountability for it, that is exactly the process that is undertaken by the Legislative Assembly through the entire main estimates process, so that all government departments and spending and revenues are considered in that regard. Now, that's answering why we're not putting it in a separate fund. As to the reporting, I know Emily very helpfully provided a very long list of items that could potentially be included in terms of reporting. There is right now, as I understand, and have been assured by the department, that most of the items that are being requested or had been previously requested are in fact part of the carbon tax report that comes out every year, to the extent that they exist. For example, if there's no fines that have been levied, then there's nothing to report on in that regard. The one exception to that list is a request specifically to have an accounting of what this tax does to GHG emissions. There are so many other potential things that can impact on GHG emissions that it's difficult to say that the tax is the reason for a reduction or an increase, because the cost of fuel, independent of the tax, may be the reason to incentivize someone, or a federal program to put someone onto solar power, for instance, may be a bigger reason. So that one item is difficult, but the other items are to be included in that annual report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Wawzonek. I'll now go to any members who are on the phone line who have questions. If you could just let me know. Emily Bonnetridge, I'll begin with you.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Merci to the minister and her staff for appearing before us regarding the carbon tax. I'm just wondering how, I'm trying to understand this, and in plain language, is as simple as terms as that could be described for the residents of the Northwest Territories and for myself. You know, at the same time, we're hearing that you're increasing the cost of fuel, yet you're providing rebates to residents. And this program was supposed to target the large emitters, kind of like to penalize them. Yet the government's almost giving back their money, 72% of it. So it just doesn't make sense. Why we really impose this carbon tax to begin with, or anybody has ever argued with the federal government on this. I'm really hoping you could just try to explain to me, for the benefit of the residents also, what's really happening here. I could start with that, Masi.
Thank you, Emily Bonnerouge. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Emily Bonnet Rouge. Certainly happy to give that another go. So the carbon tax is something that is a federal creature of statute. That's the federal government that has established the carbon tax and carbon tax rates and made changes to it. All provinces and territories, as you would have seen in the presentation, have to find some way to either comply and just have the federal tax regime imposed upon them, or develop their own system that brings them in line with what the federal government is asking us all to do with respect to carbon pricing. The goal is ultimately to reduce GHG emissions by creating an incentive for people to get themselves to reduce their use of, for example, diesel fuels, and to reduce their carbon outputs. So when the federal government changed their rates, we were required to change our rates. And so that is sort of part one of what is happening here, is that there's an increase in carbon tax rates from the federal government that we need to find a way to comply with. One of the other things that the federal government has changed in the overall system is that you can't now, right at the point of purchasing your fuel, you don't get an immediate rebate. So any point of that sort of immediate carbon price signal has to be removed. And there's also there's a few other, that's the at-source rebates have had to be removed. The rebate on heating fuel had to be removed. So that's a big one for the North, obviously. And the large emitter is another part of what has changed under the federal system, again, because of the modifications that the federal government is imposing. But the rates that are paid by the large emitters here, really it's the three large mines, are higher under our system than what they would be under the federal system. It helps provide some revenue to us to then turn around and hand over to the residents. But their effective rate at the end of it all does bring them in line in terms of the kind of tax burden that residents are paying. And the rebate program is meant to make it reasonably competitive for them to operate compared to what they'd be getting if they were under the federal rebate system. I hope that is helpful, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Wawzonek. Any follow-up, Emily Bonnerouge?
Merci, Mr. Chair, and merci, Minister, for that bit of explanation. It's probably more bureaucratic answer than a real good plain language one, because I'm not really understanding how this is really affecting our cost of living. I didn't hear you say anything about that. You're saying you removed the rebate for fuel, but I'm not sure. The fuel prices are going up, are they? But people are just not getting rebates from that. So, like, what are the benefits for residents of the Northwest Territories, and what are the pros and the cons of all this, Masi?
Thank you, Emily Bonnerouge. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, look, the ultimate benefit is if, in fact, Canadians as a whole can reduce their GHG emissions. That's the ultimate goal and benefit of the carbon tax regime. Now, how successful that will be in the Northwest Territories, where options to get off of various forms of fuel don't necessarily exist in the same way, I don't know. But beyond that, but accepting that we're within this because the federal government is using this as a way to try to reduce GHG emissions, which, I would think in the North at the front lines of climate change, we all agree is a good and valuable goal. So we're in their system and we have to figure out a way forward on it. Pros and cons, I mean, Mr. Chair, I can go through, there's pros and cons of the different options that we've presented, in terms of trying to figure out how to navigate this space. The rebates that we've proposed right now came up with based upon determining the average size of a household, average cost that's going to change from the federal system, basically your average impacts, and then trying to establish a rebate that for households would not see a significant change to their cost of living. But the downside is that there are some communities, not the majority, but some, where the impacts will be significantly more than the rebate that they are now receiving. And there will be some households that are much larger where they too may, depending on their heat usage or depending on their rebates, may find that they are not necessarily getting a rebate that matches the costs that they're seeing one way or the other. Some may get a greater rebate than what they are actually paying out and others won't. So there's some unfairness or inequity in that. But again, the attempt we made was to try to be equal, if not equitable, for a large majority. Now, again, I've certainly heard and I very clearly that that's not what committee may wish to see. And so we are looking at whether there's an alternative way of going about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Wawzonek. Are there any further questions from other members on the line?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead, Emily Simler.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the presentation. I know we had this discussion already, but and I know I raised it when we did have this discussion before, was the concern that I have is that the presentation and my understanding is that every person over 18 will be getting this rebate. But not every person over 18 is paying, when I think about it, I think of a household, of a family. You've got some people that are living at home or, some youth that are still living at home. And then they'll be receiving this, not necessarily. So you're basically saying that as a homeowner, I'm going to cover the cost of the heating fuel, but you'll give the rebate to everybody, not necessarily the person that's paying for the cost that it's going to be. And so my worry is that, there's going to be a lot of people getting this money that it's not going to the people that it's costing them. So I know the minister has said that, when you look at the chart that you provided us, you look at the Beaufort Delta, and some of those communities in the Beaufort Delta are twice as high as what you'll be giving out. So not only will somebody be paying twice as high, but then you're going to be giving the rebate to everybody else around them, and not necessarily. And then you said people that are living in low cost housing that are not necessarily paying for fuel, they will be getting this cost. We have many families who, are in the North that are on income assistance. So they're getting this money to pay, to assist them in making sure that they're covered for their rent, their meals, and then, and they'll be getting this subsidy as well, on top of getting the subsidy that they're getting from income support and subsidized rent. So I really, I understand that the minister is in this place that she needs to make a decision, but I don't think this is the right way of going about it, and then I think of it as, again, like one of my colleagues had said right at the beginning, you're pricing us Northerners out from living here. We can't afford to live here anymore. You know, long-time residents who try to live here, to try to own their own home. You know, we don't use any of the systems that are provided because, you know, we try to make a living, you know, and it's getting harder and harder to just say, why am I here? You know, like this goes against, you know, there's so many things that there's this carbon tax, the power increase, you know, if I don't live, I don't even have to live here to be subsidized to run a business anymore. You know, these are things that you're sitting here saying to the public that Northwest Territories people, you're just going to have to eat the cost and live here anyway. And then you see, you got Alberta going on and talking about how they're going to not pay any fuel tax and they're going to stop this and they're going to give their families, you know, money to offset the cost of living. And here we're sitting here on carbon tax, and here we're not even in the biggest emitters. We're the people that are being affected the most. And in the Beaufort Delta, in the coast, they're the ones that are seeing it. And now you're saying that they're going to have to pay even more because other people are killing the coastline and climate change. But yet the minister, I'm sure she has the number of what emissions that we're outputting as the Northwest Territories, but yet Canada is going to make us pay the same as everybody else. It's not affordable to live here anymore, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Semler. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to start from the back end of what Emily said. And I know we're in a public forum, but for MLAs, I do want to just make note. I'd like to share with them the most recent letter that we did send to ECCC. It'll have to go out confidentially. Not in the habit of sharing correspondence that wasn't intended sent to the receiver to be sent out publicly, but just so that I want to assure MLAs that we are hearing the concerns, and I hope you'll hear that reflected in our most recent correspondence to the federal government, because I hear what she's saying. We are the pittance of the emitters, and yet we are already facing such a high burden with such a limited opportunity to change. What is the benefit of what kind of incentive are we creating? We're just creating an increase to costs, as another way of putting it. So that's the one end of it. Now, with respect to the effort that was made initially, at least in this draft, of how to adjust for the costs of living, a lot of work was done using really an approach of trying to be as equal as possible and trying to give as many individuals as possible as residents access to a rebate that would, as best as we could determine, cover off the added burden from the increased costs. And so that's where there was a decision made to look at average household size, average household impact from the heating, from the carbon tax, and to then increase the COLO payments accordingly to offset for most households, or majority of households, the average households, what I should say, their total costs. That is not helping those who are already in the most vulnerable areas, the most vulnerable regions, those that are already paying high amounts. And that's why, again, we are going to go back and look at whether there's an opportunity to do a regional-based COLO that would have a higher rate for those communities. It's the federal government that I need to hear back from, that I don't have an answer from yet as to whether or not that will be considered viable. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Wawzonek. Any follow-up, Emily Semler?
Yeah, and I guess my beginning question was that, so you're saying every single person in WT will be getting these payments quarterly, and that's not going to be reassessed? Thanks.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did miss that. I apologize. Not quite. You have to be a tax filer. So if you file your taxes, then you are on the list for getting the rebate. Most folks do file their taxes in the Northwest Territories, and it's then that's how it's determined who gets the rebate and not. It's tax filing.
Thank you, Minister Wawzonek. Are there any further questions from members on the line?
I text our clerk, but obviously she's not looking at her phone. Chair?
Go
It's Emily Marcellos. I guess I have a large per capita of seniors in this community. And, we're trying to get seniors to age in place with dignity. Yes, they will be getting some of this tax rebate, and yes, they do get a fuel subsidy. But, the cost of living has gone up dramatically everywhere across the territories. And my concern is, this is the 9th hour. We're going to be passing this Bill 60. And, I just wonder, with comparisons to other provinces, because we don't know what everybody else negotiated with the federal government, because we live north, why aren't we given different terms of reference? And I want to hear from the minister how this came about and the mediation process, because if this was happening, say, to an Indigenous government, I would be right up front with the deputy minister of whatever and talking to them and telling them this is not going to work. And here we have our government who is representing everyone, and I've never heard about how the mediation process went, if there was a mediation process, or are we just taking it because we have to do it? Those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily Marcellos. Minister Wawzonek?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There were efforts. I mean, we knew that there was changes coming, Mr. Chair, and there were discussions between our Department of Finance and the federal government. I will note that I had a recent conversation, federal provincial territorial meeting with other provincial territorial ministers. We're not the only ones who were given a hard no with our respect to asking for specifically the heating fuel to remain an exemption, which was one of our asks. It was also an ask of the Atlantic provinces, and everyone got a hard no. They have a lot of communities that are in similar circumstances to us in terms of being very vulnerable to climate change and having some very high costs and very few options. So we got to know. The other northern territories, I think, got to know. The Atlantic provinces got to know. At this, the conversation turned to, what can we do to find a way forward and to maintain some payments back to residents, if not to businesses necessarily, but at least into the hands of residents. And that did take some time. There was the exemption for airline fuel. That was also a specific ask that was included, because again, that would be a very significant impact on costs for everyone in the north, businesses and residents alike. So, we did get that out of them. As for where this might go, as I said, there were some hard no's in the last little while, but there does seem to be a bit of a change in terms of the economic dynamics right now. I do think that the costs of living generally are something that people are hearing differently now. It is not just the same old, but somewhere between inflation, geopolitics, uncertainties, COVID, you name it. There may be a different ability to raise the issue and bring it forward. I would note too the fact that I was paying attention to what happened in COP in Egypt when the countries that are least able to pay are being looked at a little bit differently right now. And maybe that is an approach that some of the provinces and territories who are least able to pay might want to take with our federal counterparts as well. I don't know for sure where that will take me, Mr. Chair. Only just to, again, I want MLAs to know that we are certainly live to it in terms of the government of the GNWT. I'm hopeful that the federal government is live to it, and I'm hopeful that we will see a bit more movement. There hadn't been a lot of love for the position before now. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Wawzonek. Any follow-up, MLA Marcellos?
I just want for clarity. So how many meetings exactly did you have on a one-to-one basis on behalf of the people of the Northwest Territories with the federal government before we agreed to their terms of reference? And certainly not our terms of reference, or has there been any mediation? There's no clarity in your answer, Madam Minister, and I would like clarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Martselos. Minister Wawzonek?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it was, I would have had meetings with Minister Rylund, who's a Minister of Finance, who's my counterpart. It was an issue that was raised on behalf of all three territories jointly, as well as individually. Minister Gibault is Minister Thompson's counterpart, and I know the issue of climate change comes up with them quite centrally, but I'd have to confirm with him as to the nature of the discussions. I'm not in a position to speak to that. I can say there was over a dozen meetings at our officials level trying to work out the details of what we might be able to do to have exemptions and to have exemptions, and which is what landed on the fuel airline exemption ultimately. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next on the list, I have Emily Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think I just want to take just a little step back, and we're talking, a lot about the dollar impacts, which are very important. And, as per the government, the federal government, I think that's their goal, is to, hit people in the purse strings to get a reaction. And so when they say that this is in order to reduce greenhouse gases across the country, and given that half of greenhouse gases around the world are due to heating your home and cooling your home if you live down south. And, the presentation from the minister also acknowledged that half of residents are incentivized, whereas half are not incentivized. And also frequently throughout the presentation acknowledged the lack of alternatives in the Northwest Territories. And so I'm wondering if the minister can speak to, over the course of the last 4 years that carbon tax has existed in the Northwest Territories, what kind of changes have our greenhouse gas numbers incurred? Has there been a change to carbon tax on our greenhouse gases in the Northwest Territories thus far? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Cleveland. Minister Wawzonek?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I can certainly go back to the carbon tax report that would have been tabled, I think, earlier this year. As I mentioned, though, I'm not sure that we'll get to the number that perhaps Emily is really seeking, in that maybe over the course of a lengthy period of time, you'd be able to say that this was the year in which carbon taxes began, and 10, 15 years on, there's been a marked change. As they go up, then GHG emissions go down. But there's also been inputs such as changes to economic factors. So if there's a mine being built that's a much heavier, emitter, if a mine closes, it reduces the emissions. If fuel taxes go up, or fuel goes up on its own, as we've certainly seen spikes in the last while, that may impact people's choices around what they're doing. If the costs of alternatives go down, that may impact on their choices. So it is a difficult one to say that carbon taxes one for one, for example, would reduce GHG emissions. But it's my understanding that certainly when costs means the same as any other, the quote unquote sin taxes, there's an argument to be made that if there's an increased cost, that people will change their behaviors. I guess I can go back and see then what exactly I'll go back and pull the numbers from the report, and I can certainly get in touch, of course, with Minister Thompson, who may have some information from that angle as to what has happened with our GHG emission profile in the Northwest Territories, but I don't have that at hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Wawzonek. Any follow-up, Emily Cleveland?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I mean, not to beat this, but I feel like it bears repeating, is that I think that yes, there is room for there to be changes in behaviors from large emitters, absolutely. But when it comes to the residents of the Northwest Territories, there absolutely is a lack of alternatives. And so what we are doing is simply increasing the cost of living in the Northwest Territories, and we're not necessarily driving the change of behavior, because a lot of that change of behavior has to come from the GNWT. And so I don't think that the federal government, my point is the federal government is not getting the results that it wants from the Northwest Territories through this mechanism. It's not going to happen through this mechanism. If they want people to choose an alternative, then that alternative needs to be available. The alternative is not available to the people of the Northwest Territories to choose at this point. And I also would argue that we don't have the policies in place that actually help people choose alternatives as well. And so that's another concern of mine. But I want to turn to page 18 of the presentation that shows that 18 of our 33 communities sit above the line of the average carbon tax paid on heat per household, that $400 line there on the rebate. And so if over half of our NWT communities are actually being negatively impacted and not actually receiving the subsidy, to me, this way of dealing with carbon tax doesn't really hold water if over half of our communities are not seeing that. And so I'm wondering if the GNWT plans to release the impact of home heating, especially per community specifically, so that people know exactly what the change to the cost of living will be by community, and if this information would be made public as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Cleveland. Minister Wawzonek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I was just looking at the chart at page 18, and so those are the numbers of communities, but it's actually a very small percentage of population in terms of resident numbers. As I've said earlier, though, it is arguably some of the communities that already pay the highest cost of living. So I don't for a moment want to be considered to not be cognizant of that. But in terms of the, trying to find a way to reduce the impacts of the federal increase to as many residents as possible, the approach that was taken was to take the average and to take the average household and the average costs and to then apply that number. And there's a vast majority of people will see a rebate that more than compensates or more than compensates for what we estimate the impacts, both direct and indirect, of the carbon tax increase to be. It won't benefit the smaller percentage of those who are in communities where that line, where they are over that line. I don't have that total number, but I can certainly figure that out. And I can give a breakdown for what we anticipate the average household carbon tax burden to be by community, but I'll propose to do that to committee after the presentation, and it can be marked public thereafter.
Thank you, Minister Wawzonek. Next on the list, I have Emily O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I do want to respond to some of the comments I think I've heard about reporting of carbon tax revenues and whether we're actually making any progress on greenhouse gas reductions. The reporting that is happening is discretionary. There's nothing in this bill or the previous legislation that requires reporting. So, new minister, next assembly, there might not be any reports. But I think my other point is that, it's not integrated reporting. We have 3 separate reports, one on the carbon tax, one from ENR on the climate change strategic framework, and another one from infrastructure on the energy initiatives. They should be integrated into one report, which is what I've always said. And this gets back to what the Office of the Auditor General has said in their climate change audit, the lack of leadership from this government on climate change. And we don't even have a way of reporting any of this together. But I want to move on to a question about methane. Methane is 80 times more damaging to this planet than carbon dioxide. What is being done, if anything, around methane regulation, restrictions, reporting? Is methane going to be reported or taxed in any way with this new approach? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Minister Wawzonek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So GNWT is not independently at this point, and again, subject to checking back in with ENR, taking any steps to independently regulate methane, and I don't know what our outputs of methane might be in the GNWT or in the NWT. Whether the federal government is going to move in that direction or not, I don't know. I can undertake to get some information, but I would be at the behest of the federal government to do that. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Follow-up, Emily O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, I'm trying to figure out how to go about this. All right. It's my understanding that methane is being, is going to be included in other jurisdictions, particularly those that have large petroleum sectors, that it's somehow going to be included and taxed in some way. What's happening with methane in the Northwest Territories, if anything? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Minister Wawzonek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm going to suggest I'll direct that over to Mr. Coutre, please.
Mr. Coutre.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Perhaps I'm not totally understanding the question, but it might help for committee that we did get an exemption from the federal government on flaring due to the minimal amount of flaring that goes on in the NWT. And my understanding is that's subject for review by the federal government in the intervening years to ensure that those minimal levels comply with that exemption order. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to any members online if they have any further questions. Seeing and hearing none, are there any further questions from members in the room? Emily Cleveland and Emily O'Reilly, I'll give you one more each. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my first question is, given that there will be a significant impact to the bottom line of the GNWT, will the GNWT qualify for any kind of additional rebate from the federal government, or will that have an impact on our territorial funding from the federal government in order to make up for the significant cost, especially from public housing and public infrastructure? Thank you.
You, Emily Cleveland. Minister Wawzonek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sadly, no, we don't get any kind of rebate from the federal government. As for impacts on territorial formula financing, I think that I'm not sure what the answer to that would be right now. I mean, that is not a calculation that necessarily takes into, account carbon tax specifically, but it would certainly be looking obviously at the ability to spend in accordance with other provinces. So if our ability to spend is constrained and other provinces are spending more, but that's not necessarily attached to carbon taxes. So yeah, Mr. Chair, I'll certainly go and have a bit of a more conversation about what that might do to us. But really at this point, it increases the burden on the GNWT without any obvious income coming in as a result. So again, if there's more to that I can provide after some conversation with the department, I certainly will.
Thank you, Minister Wawzonek. Emily Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. No, and I'm very curious to see what that bottom line impact might be, because that means that we have less money to spend on social programs, we have less money to spend on our northern infrastructure, and so there's only so much money that the GNWT has, and stretching that even farther for a program that really I think has minimal impact for its goal in the territory is very worrisome to me. My next question is, there's a large emitter program, but there's a significant increase as well to operating a business, operating a nonprofit, to Indigenous governments. And so I'm wondering if small businesses, nonprofits, or local and Indigenous governments will receive any kind of offset as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Cleveland. Minister Wawzonek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm going to turn that one over to the Deputy Minister in a moment, but I did want to actually just come back to the last question, because I'm kind of giving it a bit more thought and having a bit of a check-in over here. But again, keeping in mind that we will see increased costs. I mean, we do see the revenue inputs that come back from the tax. So while that may not give comfort to Emily O'Reilly, who earlier asked that those revenues be spent specifically on climate change initiatives, it may answer Emily Cleveland's issue in saying that social programs and other various programs of the government wouldn't be impacted by our increased costs if it's sort of revenue in, revenue out. So, maybe a satisfying answer for one and not for another, but that's that. And then if I could just turn to the Deputy Minister with respect to rebates for communities, Indigenous governments, small businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we aren't considering any rebates for, well, that may be considered down the road. We've opened the door and to departments and other groups to come forward with applications for measures that will allow them to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So if they can come forward with a program which would reduce emissions, then potentially that would reduce the amount of tax that they would pay. So that's one way that they can reduce the burden of the carbon tax on those groups. And I don't think there's anything else to that question, Minister. Yeah, so the door is open for that. It's just a short answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. Emily O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess what I've seen so far is that there's a lot of unfairness and grief that has been spread around as a result of this initiative. Consultations were done with the large emitters, but nobody else in developing this proposal. The large emitters are going to still get some kind of 72% rebate, but if you're a small business, an NGO, a local government, you're not going to get any kind of rebates. And somehow they're supposed to be able to pass the costs on, but large emitters that are producing diamonds can't pass those costs on to the people that are buying diamonds. I just don't buy that. The COLO proposal is not fair to people in smaller communities, particularly those in the rural remote areas. Look at slide 18. There's going to be people that will actually make money under this COLO approach. And then, the reporting accountability of this money coming in. We set up separate funds, revolving funds for mundane things like beverage containers, 911, MTS, Marine Transportation System, but we can't or we won't do it for a carbon tax. That's just not right. So, but I guess the only two things that I've heard today are that you're going to continue to do some work on are maybe regionalizing COLO payments in some way to account for the smaller, more remote communities that have higher fuel costs, and maybe something around a homeowner heating subsidy, I think I heard. So when are you going to have some specific proposals on those two areas to present to committee and the public? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Minister Wawzonek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it doesn't work well to put something forward if we don't know whether or not ACCC or the federal government is going to accept any proposal or not. So I can certainly, perhaps in our correspondence back with other commitments today, we will hopefully be able to provide a target date, but I'm reluctant to set a date, and then I don't hear back in time from the federal government. That date doesn't help anyone very much. I'm also conscious that committee is only just beginning its public process. Certainly MLAs have been quite clear with respect to wanting to see a different regional approach, again, subject to whether the feds will let us do that or not. But maybe there is some other idea or methodology out there to mitigate these impacts while still creating the right incentives that we all want to see. So I'm also still wanting to keep that door open to not close down those conversations prematurely. But I'll do my best in our responding letter, as I've said, to hopefully have a date by then as to when we can put something forward, or better yet, to be able even maybe to share kind of where we're hoping to go with it. But again, anything we're doing in this space really is quite dependent on having the approval of ACCC, which was what put us in a bit of a tough spot previously in terms of wanting to move quickly and to discuss with them what we would do for the large emitter system. And I don't want to create an expectation that I can't live to, given that I can't control what's happening over in Ottawa. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Wawzonek. I I have a couple questions. I guess to me, one of the biggest losers here are our municipal governments who will see all of their heating costs go up, and we already underfund them, and we underfund them specifically in infrastructure where they perhaps could find some ways to retrofit old buildings and their aging infrastructure and reduce that heating cost, but they can't because they don't have the upfront capital. And I'll note, GNWT we're gonna make about $9 million a year going off forward on this, which, and municipalities are gonna spend an extra, well, I don't know, millions, I guess. So I guess there's a two-part question there. Do we have an estimated cost of what this is going to cost communities? And, have we had any conversation with them about whether a rebate would make sense or simply just, perhaps splitting some of the revenue on the transfers we give to municipal governments? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, let me turn that, I'll start with the Deputy Minister, and we may wind up kind of doing a bit of a panel discussion here as to what discussions were had and what options were considered. I'll just start by saying that, again, the removal of the rebates wasn't because we wanted to remove rebates. It's because of the changes that were done to the federal systems, this federal structure, and that's what removed under the federal requirements for the carbon tax regime, remove the ability to offer those rebates to communities and to small government or to small businesses, and removed anything that was negating the price signal. So those things is what started to remove our ability to provide some rebates now. But in terms of the impacts now that we're anticipating and any other thoughts, let me turn actually to Kelly Black, please.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you know, we didn't give any exemptions for communities or businesses. One of the problems that we have is that how do you decide how much each one uses to do that? So for communities, we provide under the GNWT and the Department of Municipal Communities, we provide them with community grants, and those would also include the costs that will be increased because of their fuel costs increasing. And it would be the same thing under the tax, is the same thing as the price of fuel going up for communities. That's where they get compensated for that. And for businesses, the variety of business we have makes it almost impossible to properly account for how much they're going to be paying in carbon tax and how much that extra burden is. We have to make some assumptions that they will be passing it on to consumers, and that will be the way they get they address the fact that the cost of business is going up. And then at the same time, we have a myriad of programs for businesses to reduce their overall consumption, which will in the end save them on their carbon tax and also on their cost of doing business. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. I guess, it's a budgetary question about when we see this increased revenue and, it disproportionately affects our community governments. I think there's a strong argument to be made that we should be sharing some of it with them, considering we already underfund them. I guess my other question is on the cost of living offsets. I'll note right now under the Northern Living Allowance, which is, a similar kind of cost of living thing we give for GNWT. If you're in Saxe Harbor, you're getting about $37,000, and if you're in Yellowknife, you're getting $3,700. So we already recognize that, it's almost a tenfold difference. And on this chart, we're giving them the exact same payment for a cost of living offset. And I'm just, to me, if we're going to call it a cost of living offset, and even regardless of the home heating cost of living offset, the entire COLO framework seems to me it should have some built-in regional variation that reflects the cost of living, which is exponentially higher in those communities. So I guess I know the department's looking at this, but in the form of a question, is that something the minister is willing to consider? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I do sometimes forget that we do some of these discussions first with committee without necessarily be open to the public. So look, if I was jumping the gun in the response, thank you for reminding me to back up for a second and say that, again, as I've said in this presentation, the effort that was being made was as close as possible to give as many residents as possible an amount that would, offset as near as possible the increased impacts of the increased carbon tax. We did that based on the average family income, the average family costs, and et cetera. Averages are not always equitable. That is quite real, and that message was received back when we first appeared in front of committee, loud and clear. So it's at that point that we said, look, we are going to go back and see for fortunately a small number of residents, but the residents who are impacted significantly. And so for those who are so impacted that we are looking at what we could do, what we could propose to better offset that much higher burden on them and see whether or how that will accord with what the federal government has in mind with their goals. And, maybe somewhere along the way see what we can do more generally for the impacts of heating fuel, or to find better ways of an alternative. $5,000 for a heat pump doesn't necessarily help very much in the Northwest Territories, even if it does elsewhere in Canada. So perhaps they have other ideas they can offer to us too. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you. And one more comment is that I think what's effective April 1, most of the territory is going to see about a 17-cent increase on their home heating bill, because most people heat their houses with diesel, and by 2030 that's going to be 45 cents. I think we perhaps as a government we're just dealing with this carbon tax right now, but we have to probably look at all of our strategies. I think that price changes a lot of dynamics. You're already seeing a market shift in Yellowknife. More and more people are switching to propane, and by the time that propane has a 20 cents less tax on it, perhaps it's just smarter both for liability and cost effectively to be heating with propane instead of diesel, where effective in Yellowknife or in the territory where you can get diesel. Similarly, we're seeing that switch as a government-wide to biomass, because especially once you add 45 cents onto diesel, it's becoming competitive. In Tolston right now, electric heat is competitive at about 9 cents. That's they have some commercial electric heating, but perhaps, the Power Corp has to look at a long-term balance. Every time we increase 4 cents a liter on diesel, that closes a little. And if we actually build Tolston and have a surplus. So I just think we have a entire energy strategy and climate change framework and rebate system that has never seen these numbers and never ran the data. And someone's going to have to go away and allow consumers to make decisions, going into 2030, what system they replace in their house. Do they go to propane? Do they try and find biomass? Is more commercial heating going to be available? And none of that information is available right now. So I guess that's a larger take back that I think we've kind of lost the plot, that it's hard to switch in the NWT, but we should at least give people the information about what they should be doing as 2030 comes. So with that, will the minister kind of take back to our counterparts and review those strategies to make sure where we have numbers of what diesel's projected to cost versus other things, that it reflects this, because a lot of things were said to be not competitive at all, but you add 45 cents a liter onto it, it changes the math. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's, not presuming that other questions couldn't be answered, but that's perhaps a good place to end ultimately. Fundamentally, that's the goal. Fundamentally, the goal is to get folks off of diesel, to get people onto cleaner forms of heating, ultimately cleaner forms of energy, broadly speaking, whether it's for electricity or heat. I certainly take the point, and I think others would too, that the scale and impacts in the last couple of years and the changes that we've seen are changing numbers and changing business cases and changing motivations. So yes, that's what ultimately we would need to see as a society. Now, how we get there and the finer tuning points of it, for example, folks in Polytech and what their options are versus those in Yellowknife, that's a lot of what the work we're going to do here now shortly with respect to carbon tax. But yes, as I'm sure you hear many ministers say, we can't speak one for the other, but I certainly will endeavor to see what kind of a discussion can be had with the remaining time of this government that's left, so that residents have a better understanding of what's coming in the next 8 years, a better understanding of what options are available to them, and maybe how they would shake out in terms of the impacts on their cost of living, knowing what's coming down in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Wawzonek. And with that, I will thank the department and staff and end this public hearing. As I stated at the beginning, committee will receive submissions from any business owners, any members from the public. We will be sending stakeholder letters out shortly. This is just the beginning, but thank you for your time, Minister Wawzonek, and for the commitments made today. Take a 2-minute break.